All right, so we're talking about some of the writing on 90210. The show kind of tackled a lot of social issues, drunk driving, teen pregnancy, all this kind of stuff. Why did you want to do those kind of issue shows?
You know, that was, I would say at the beginning, a real passion of Chuck Rosen, who was the showrunner, the first season of the show. And I mean, he ran the show for years, but I mean, from the beginning, Chuck was, he loved the social issues. And we kind of like went head to head a little bit, like, okay, let's not make this, you know, the white shadow, or you know, it was like, how do we do the social issues and keep the show about the lives of the students? And I think what we found was, I mean, the lives of our characters and the small emotional stuff, without it becoming overly just completely plot driven by social issues. So I think we found a happy medium where we really thought, which was what I always thought the show should, you know, why I wanted to do the show, which is, how do you look at the lives of teenagers today and what makes them interesting now? And I think that's what we were always looking at. What are the stories that the relevant stories that weren't being told, that so much of, it's hard to imagine now, but so much of what teenagers were the lives they were living those stories were kind of like taboo on network television. And we were always basically about pushing the line of saying, like, wait, these are the real lives of these characters. And, you know, we have to tell these stories, otherwise we're going to be irrelevant to our audience. We want to be a relevant show. So I think that's where we were always thinking about, like, what are those relevant stories?
So did you get pushback from the network on some of those then?
Yeah, we got, absolutely. I mean, at the time, any stories about teenagers and sex they were really always tough stories to do. I mean, and those are the stories you wanted to do. And yeah, there was the first season, in a way, I kind of feel like we were very much under the radar. They weren't paying that much attention to us, and we got to do a lot. And I think it's like you know, Brandon slept with his old high school girlfriend in episode 4. And I think they just weren't watching the show, or they didn't notice. But it's a bit of a double standard, because when Brenda slept with Dylan at her, you know, the spring dance, it was like, suddenly it was a big deal. The affiliates went nuts. And this whole notion of doing stories about teen sexuality was just always like really difficult, because I think there was still, network television was still stuck in this kind of like 50s mentality about teens and sex. And the mentality was, you don't talk about teenagers having sex, you don't think about teenagers having sex, you don't think about it in a way that the parents, I guess, of the kids that were in high school at the time, who were sort of running the networks, like, were just kind of, they were still like the children of the 50s who just had their, you know, their hands over their ears about any thought that their children were promiscuous in high school. And they were just, you know, those stories were like, you know, which were the stories we all want to tell, were you know, kind of hadn't been told on television in a way.
So was there any fallout from that spring dance episode?
Oh, there was, yeah, a lot of fallout from the spring dance episode, which I wrote that episode. It was the first, and I directed it. It was the first thing I'd ever directed. And again, it was writing these things, we weren't thinking they were such a big deal. In fact, they were written like, just like, oh, these are the lives of the characters. These are the stories that would happen. Brenda sleeps with Dylan at the spring dance, and it's like, you know, everyone's, you know, is sort of like, there's a lot of like congratulating her, and there's kind of some, you know, that of course it's a big deal that she loses her virginity, but she was losing it in a way that wasn't like, it wasn't a shameful experience. It was a happy experience for her. And writing the episode, certainly for me, and I think anyone involved in the writer's room at the time, there wasn't a sense like, we're breaking ground here. You know, it was like part of the high school experience. And so it was sort of surprising when the show aired, did well, and then it was right around the time the show started to take off. And I think Fox got a lot of complaints from their affiliates that they, were just sort of freaking out that this high school girl had sex with her boyfriend at the spring dance and enjoyed it, and there were no sort of repercussions. So that led to an episode the next season where Brenda had a pregnancy scare, an episode that I wrote, and I thought I didn't want someone else to write it because I wanted to write it in a way that hopefully felt like it was not going to be, too much like some kind of 1950s horror tale about, the perils of having sex. But in fact, there was an idea that Brenda had to have consequences based on her having had sex with Tillett.
Wow.
Yeah. So sexuality was I think our sort of it was always a minefield in terms of teens and sex at that time.
So you mentioned the show had kind of a slow start the first season. Talk about how it kind of gained in popularity.
The show was it came on, it was under the radar at the beginning. The ratings were very low, and I think we did an order of 12, then they gave us a back order of 6 and another 3. They were being dribbled in, and then they called and said, this is at the beginning of the whole idea of demographics, and it was always about pure audience and share, just the number of people were watching. And then they said, it's really interesting that, the research said that 70% of, teenage girls watching television were watching Beverly Hills 90210. So they suddenly realized that they had this enormous, it was like an iceberg in a way, that the audience was watching. It was huge. It just wasn't the audience they were used to looking at. And then they brought us back in the summer, the second season, and the show began to snowball even after the first season, even after the first episodes aired. The reruns, the ratings would go up for the reruns. So it was you got the sense that the whole thing was snowballing, and they gave us, me and Chuck Rosen this sort of good news, bad news at the end of the first season. The good news is we're getting renewed, but the bad news is we have to go back into production in 8 weeks because we're coming on in the summer. So we never got a break. We went on vacation to Hawaii together and started beating out the next season, and we began to air the second season in the summer, and that's when the show really took off. And I think before that, Luke Perry was mobbed at a shopping mall, had to be kind of snuck out, and then it just sort of exploded after that. Mm-hmm. And it was crazy because it went from a fairly small audience, a little bit under the radar, to later that year being on the cover of Rolling Stone.
Wow.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about working with the cast. There was a lot written at the time about who was fighting with who and whatnot. Did it ever affect production? What was your perspective on it?
Well, the perspective was that everybody was very young, and it was getting these overnight success for this entire cast, and there wasn't anybody else but them in terms of being the teen heartthrobs. There weren't really big teen heartthrobs at the time. It was, and there were no reality stars. It was these guys were suddenly overnight incredibly famous, and they also had to work 15 hours a day. So I would say that given those circumstances, they were out partying and behaving like they should, like they would be in their 20s, but by the sort of yardstick of what goes on today, they were just kind of living their lives. Obviously, Shannon was a handful, but I always feel like she brought so much of that fiery spirit to her character, which was so great for the show. And they were they were burning the candle at both ends, and they were living like rock stars.
Mm-hmm. And so Shannon actually did leave the show in season 4, I
Right,
think.
right.
Why did she leave?
I think it was like, I think it was mutual. Everybody, I think, it got to the point where the cast was just sort of like, had enough of Shannon, and Shannon probably had enough of the whole. I think she needed to like, be free from all this for a while. But it wasn't long before Aaron Spelling, she was starring in another Aaron Spelling show, Charmed.
Mm-hmm.
So Shannon's a terrific actress, and I think is like, always felt as incredibly key to the success of the show.
So then you created Melrose Place in 1992.
Right.
So we're talking a little off camera. How much did you still stay with 90210 at that point? And
I stayed with that. I mean, Melrose Place was sort of a spin-off of 90210, sort of a planted spin-off. So I was really, I would say, I have a lot of authorship, I would say, the first, writing the scripts, the first 50 episodes of 90210. And then I was really focused in terms of my writing was on Melrose Place after that. And, I always feel like, I think part of creating a show is the idea that you also get to work with talented people who keep it going. Because, I mean, I think you can't, as a writer or an actor, it's tough to be on a show for, 300 episodes or 10 years or whatever. So I was very, I was anxious and excited to create something new, and had the opportunity to create Melrose Place, which I based, which was inspired by this idea that I lived in my 20s in an apartment building in West Hollywood, where sort of a courtyard apartment building with a pool, and everybody that lived there was sort of like in their 20s, not necessarily stabbing each other in the back and having sex with each other, but the idea of this time after college, between graduating from college and learning to become an adult. And sort of that was my pitch for Melrose Place. And it was, in fact, I think it suffered from being a spin-off of 90210 because it really had nothing to do with 90210. But I think it was a way to sort of get the audience engaged. But our storytelling at the beginning of Melrose Place was very influenced by 90210 in that we were telling close-ended stories with, a little bit of, there were kind of morality plays in a way. And I think I was a little gun shy about the amount of sex that the characters could have on Melrose Place, having just, it was a traumatic experience dealing with the sex on 90210. So I remember at one point, I think it was Peter Chernin said, "It's okay, those characters can have as much sex as they want." And when I heard that, I was like, okay, well, now we can have fun. But I think Melrose had a very rocky start because of that, because of its sort of ties to 90210, and it was sort of like, I kind of brought too much of the DNA of 90210 into Melrose Place, and it wasn't until late into the first season that because the show was kind of like, it was really, like flailing around in terms of the ratings and everything. It looked like it wasn't going to make it. I thought, okay, I just have to like have a lot of fun with this and write a show that people are not going to be able to stop watching. And at that point, we had Heather Locklear involved, and I think having her involved just kind of gave me permission to go into this soapier direction. And I never really thought about writing a soap. I was kind of like a little bit like embarrassed by the idea of, oh no, a soap opera. It's like I watched them a little bit. I wasn't a big soap fan, but I loved the idea of, really it was just like, I wanted to write these shows so that people just couldn't turn away, like almost like watching a car accident every week. They wouldn't know what was going to happen from one minute to the next, because I felt like I had only one last chance to sort of like grab an audience. And so that's sort of how the storytelling in Melrose Place kind of evolved, more really out of a sense of desperation and like, okay, we've got to like kind of take these characters from dealing with their issues and their small problems to making the show just like completely fun and campy. And I thought, if I'm going to do a soap, I want to do a soap that's like that has a self-awareness about its soapiness, and just kind of like go all the way with it and do the kind of nighttime soap that I would want to watch, and so that started to work, and then it got to be really fun. I have to say the first 22 episodes of Melrose Place were a slog. 20 episodes, they were really a slog, and then once I kind of got over that hump, it became a blast, actually.
So let's talk about some of those memorable storylines from Melrose. Matt got beaten up for being gay
Right.
and fired in season 1, Dreams Come True.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that, and then how did the network respond to that as well?
I would say that the censorship issues on Melrose Place really were dealt around the gay, having a gay character, and I'm gay, and I really thought you can't do a show about living in West Hollywood and not have a gay character, and I really wanted to have a gay character whose sexuality was sort of not, didn't completely define who he was, but yet we had to tell stories about dating and some issues, and there were at the time there were so many issues revolving around being gay. There were AIDS and discrimination, and so it was a way to deal with some of those issues through that character. And there was a lot of pushback from the network on anything to do with Matt in terms of dating guys. There was an episode where we tried to show a kiss and we shot it, but in fact they didn't. The network cut it. We shot it.
That was the end of season 2, I think. Billy and Allison's almost wedding.
Right. And gay bashing and AIDS and all sorts of there were a lot of really relevant stories to tell with that character. The network, I felt was in a way there. This was sort of the early '90s, and it would sort of be it was kind of offensive in terms of the way they discussed the character and what he could and couldn't do, and it would be like the best. It's hard to go back and imagine that time, but it would be like if you looked at the movie The Help and the way African Americans were looked at and treated, and that people were just very cavalier about, how they would demean them and talk about, African Americans. That's the way people talked about gay people, and that's the way they talked about that character. They would basically say it was gross. They would say we don't want to see that, and we don't want to see him, hold someone's hand or kiss someone or it was, there were a lot of fights, and things have changed 180 degrees. And I think we got one of the first GLAAD awards actually, Melrose Place for that character. And I'm really proud of that character, and I think he's I'm not sure he's not the reason people watch the show, but it was great to sort of get him in the back door in terms of getting that being able to deal with those issues and have a character on television who the storyline wasn't about. It was not, the issue wasn't that he was gay. It was the issues that come with being gay. Mm-hmm. And I think up to that point it was if you had a gay character on television, it was or if you were thinking about a gay character, the issue for that character would be, oh my God, he's gay. And in this case, the character had a lot, he was just had a life, and he was leading his life.
So perhaps the most talked about moment ever on Melrose Place was when Kimberly takes off the wig.
Right.
So tell us about that episode.
So Marcia Cross was having an affair with Michael, Thomas Calabro, and she was really terrific actress. And there was an episode where they were driving back from dinner, and he'd given her a ring, and she was so excited, and they end up driving off a cliff. And I remember being there and watching that stunt, which was fantastic. We drove the car off the cliff. And then I thought, oh my God, we killed Kimberly. This is terrible because we love Kimberly. We're really going to miss her. And so I kind of had this notion that, we should let this character, because we could, we were just at the beginning of starting to think about the show in a very outrageous way. And I said to the writers, let's have her go away for a long time, and she's dead. We just imagine she's dead, but that she comes back, that she hadn't died, and that she comes back with a vengeance, and she's a little crazy, but we don't find that out right away, and that we reveal that when she has sex with Michael and goes in the bathroom, and she looks in the mirror and pulls off her wig, and you see this awful, gigantic, disgusting scar. And we just thought, I think with Melrose Place, whenever we were just like kind of roaring with laughter in the writer's room with an idea, we were like, yes, Chuck Pratt, who was a writer on the show, I remember I was pitching it and I thought it was so crazy, and he was like, yes, let's do it. And it was like one of those times when we just thought, let's go all the way out to the ledge and, hope it works. Mm-hmm. And, it's like those moments that you just sort of learn to trust your gut in a way, because when you're thinking about them, you're kind of feeling like, this is too crazy, or, are we really going to do this? And I think that's what really, with this show, it's what entertains the audience. Mm-hmm. And us, believe me. I think we were, I would say with Melrose Place, we were laughing with our storylines. With Sex and the City, we were laughing in the writer's room with the jokes. It's like you think, that's when you're laughing in a writer's room, something is working.
Mm-hmm. So the show was known for a lot of love triangles and rectangles and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Did you have any favorite couples that you enjoyed breaking up and reuniting again to write for?
Well, I always loved torturing Billy and Allison. Sydney and Michael were just so much fun to write. I mean, it was just this sort of S&M relationship on both sides, and so that was always a lot of fun. Anything that Heather Locklear had to do with Amanda was fantastic. I mean, I would say she was. If I had to pick a character that was the most fun to write, I would say she was number one, and Kimberly and Sydney were sort of up there too. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The show actually got a lot of internet buzz right when internet buzz was kind of becoming a thing. Mm-hmm. Were you guys paying attention to the online chatter?
I don't really remember online chatter for Melrose Place. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just don't. I think I remember CompuServe. I think there were message boards. I think that's what I remember. There was CompuServe. And but I'm not sure. I think it was like a weird thing that like, wow, people wrote something about the show. Mm-hmm. But we weren't really like. I don't think we were watching them or anything like that. They weren't significant to us. Yeah. I think they're really like. I think it's dangerous myself as a writer to get sucked into the vortex of reading audience feedback, because you really have to kind of like you have to trust your instincts. You have to put yourself in a bubble, and everybody has an opinion. It's really easy to look at things, and basically it's sort of like having just a million voices in your head saying, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like that. And it's like at some point you just sort of lose your compass. And I think I don't really look. I mean, I'll look after a season maybe is aired, once in a while, but I only want to read the good stuff. If somebody writes something bad, it's really like, I don't really want to see it. So I don't really pay attention, because you know what, there's just a million opinions out there, and you don't get, I feel like you really only want to read the boards to get stroked, and it's like you don't really need that. You don't need that either. Mm-hmm. And I think the flip side of seeing of just like I think you got to keep like a little bit of a Chinese wall between yourself and the audience, and sort of put out the show you want to give them, and hope that they like it, and make your writing instincts about being true to your vision and the characters, and hope the audience responds. But I think you can't be too influenced by sort of what the audience is thinking.
Mm-hmm. So both 90210 and Melrose Place pretty much became huge pop culture phenomenons in the 90s. And what was that like for you, just kind of within like 3 years, to have two huge hits on the air?
Yeah, I think at the time I was really aware of it, but I kind of had blinders on, because I was working just inhumanely in a way. It wasn't at that age. It's like not inhumane because it's like you can do it. I don't know how I did it. I mean, we did 32 episodes a year of those shows. I mean, it was 90210 started at 22, but then it went to 28, and we rolled right into that season of 28. And then I wrote the Melrose Place pilot while we were doing the second season of 90210, and then we did 34 hours in Melrose Place the first season, and then at least 32 every year after that. And
did you sleep in the 90s?
I just was kind of like, I remember literally seeing wedding invitations that I hadn't opened, friends, you know, and I was like, oh my God, I didn't open my mail for 2 months, and someone got married, and I didn't even see the wedding invitation. Yeah, it was just like, that was it. It was just doing the show, and it was like, it was exciting to be doing it and having it work. I think it was torture to be doing it. Certainly Melrose Place that first season when it wasn't working at the beginning, it was really hard. But I think you sort of have blinders on in terms of the magazine covers and all that sort of stuff, and just focus on doing the show every week, because you don't really have the time to like sit back and enjoy, bask in it. You know, you kind of bask in it years later, like, wow, that worked. People loved it. But at the time, you're just kind of like, you don't have much of a life, and you're just focused on, you're just thinking, what's that next episode going to be? And that's all. And there's that fear of just like, what's it going to be? You know, what's the next one? What's the next one? So it kind of keeps you very occupied, let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think is the legacy of Beverly Hills 90210?
I think the legacy of 90210 is that it really lives on as in sort of the hearts of the audience who were around at that time to experience and watch it and love it, and it touched their lives. I think it touched people's lives in a sense that one thing television does is it sort of brings people into your living room, and I think it made I hope it made a lot of the kids watching it feel like they belonged to something, you know, and less lonely in high school, and feel like they were sort of like sharing that high school experience with all these other friends that they had that were the cast of 90210. And I think that older people that watch the show were able to like vicariously live their high school experience again. But I do think the show, I think it touched people, and I think that's why it was successful. I think, you know, and I think especially at the beginning, I think it really the fact that it was such a worldwide success was also really amazing, that the American high school experience sort of traveled so well to all these countries. The show was like successful everywhere. And I actually thought when the 90210 was airing in the Soviet Union before the Berlin Wall, I was like, oh my God, if they're watching 90210, it's like they can't, like they have to, like their hearts and minds have to change. You know, it's like, and in fact they did in a way, not just because of 90210, but because I think of American cultural influence, I think had a lot to do with sort of everything, you know, the whole change over there. I remember thinking like, wow, they're watching this show, which is so different than their lives. But I think countries are different, people interpret it differently. Some is just a complete fantasy, but with all the trappings of like the wealth in Beverly Hills, I kind of felt like that was like the Trojan horse that let people into the lives of the characters. And the characters are really what touched people. I mean, they weren't watching a show because they wanted to see Beverly Hills.
What about the impact of Melrose Place?
I think the impact of Melrose Place is it was just really, I think it was a fun ride, and I think for people there, I think it was outrageous and fun, and I think that no one of that generation had been exposed to a nighttime soap that they could call their own. So there hadn't been a nighttime soap for that generation, or in a generation in a way. And I think it was like something that I think it became like a water cooler show, and people got to talk about it, and it brought people together. And I think there was if there's a DNA that connects both of those shows and all the shows I've done, including Sex and the City, it's like this sense of family that the characters create with each other. You know, whether it's on 90210 is this family of high school kids that support each other through high school. Melrose Place is a very dysfunctional family that lives together in this apartment building that sort of like they have a love-hate relationship with each other. Or Sex and the City about women that sort of support each other, um, and their main goal in life is not, that there is not to get married, which was kind of revolutionary, but that in fact that their friendships are, between each other is what sustains them, and that they create their own family.
So we're going to talk more about Sex and the City in a minute.
Sure.
But you actually parted ways with Spelling Entertainment in 1995. Talk about what that was like, because you'd pretty much only done television with Spelling
Right.
at that point.
Right. Well, I really felt like I couldn't. I had. I felt like I had, first of all, a lot of authorship of 90210 and Melrose Place, and Aaron was like a legend in the industry, and I knew that like if I continued to do shows with Aaron, I would always be living under Aaron's shadow, and I was lucky to have him as a friend and a mentor at the time when for years, but I felt it was important for me to sort of like, I was also young enough where I needed to sort of like do my own thing and basically just cut the ties in a way, and it's a hard thing to do when you sort of like leave successful series, but I had done them for a long time, and I had felt like I was personally I was played out in terms of telling those stories, and I needed to find a new way to tell stories and just go off on my own in a sense.
And you actually went to New York at that point, right?
I went to New York. I really wanted to come to New York. I've always had a bit of a love affair with New York. I grew up on the East Coast, and I had an idea to do a show about a nighttime soap set in New York that kind of would look at New York in a glamorous way, and that was Central Park West. I hadn't lived in New York a lot, but this was sort of in a way my way to live and work in New York, and I wanted to film the show in New York. And CBS really was anxious to kind of bring in a younger audience, which, as unfortunately as the story went on, they kind of changed regimes and decided that's not what they wanted to be, sort of over the course of doing the show. But in so many great ways, it got me to be in New York, and I think it was, aside from Law and Order, Central Park West was one of, and it's kind of little seen because it's not on DVD, it's not really available, it's not online, it's not streaming, I don't know why, but I think people would still enjoy it. It's a great time capsule of the mid '90s, and sort of like, it was one of the first shows in I don't know how long to look at New York in a glamorous way. I mean, New York up to that point was just thought of as a really urban jungle, and there was Law and Order shooting in New York, and that was it. And Central Park West was the first show to come in and look at New York from sort of as a playground and a fun, glamorous city that wasn't a scary city. And in fact, I felt like New York and LA had sort of flipped a little bit. I mean, LA was still sort of reeling from the riots and O.J. Simpson, and it was like, didn't feel like a happy place to me. And New York felt like it was, I felt like it was about to kind of explode, and it did. I mean, it really did, and it was an amazing time to sort of be in the city doing a show when we were almost the only game in town except for Law and Order, and so we had a really, really, it was a great time doing that show. Actually, it just didn't fit with the network, and they sort of changed course and changed directions, and but it was nice to sort of, for me, just to kind of like, for better or for worse, to kind of completely be on my own and be doing a show that was that I hope people get the chance to see if it gets out there.
Mm-hmm. So then your next show is another New York-based show, Sex and the City. Right.
So when I was out here doing Central Park West, it was a network show, but I was kind of spending time in New York and thinking about the fact that when the show went down, that I wanted to do a show that was more closer to just something that closer to the lives of people I knew in a real way. And I knew Candace Bushnell, and I read her column, and I knew she had a column, Sex and the City, and I love the idea of using the character of a writer who was writing about her lives, but then the story would also be about her. And the columns weren't fiction. They weren't about four women. They were sort of pieces of journalism. But I also knew Candace, and I think that I was able to, create create something that, a character that I felt could be almost like a Holly Golightly in terms of the 90s or late 90s. In fact, when one way I pitched it was sort of like a Mary Tyler Moore for the new millennium. But beyond that, it was like, I just really wanted to do something that was like the anti-television show. I didn't want to bring it to a network. I mean, ABC was interested in it, and I remember asking them at the time, can you even call the show Sex and the City? And really, I loved the Larry Sanders Show. HBO wasn't, except for Larry Sanders, they weren't known for series, but they were interested in doing this. At one point, I was interested in developing it as a movie, but I brought it to HBO with the idea that it would be sort of, for me, the equivalent of like an independent film for television, and that it would be on a movie channel, which HBO basically was a movie channel. It wasn't known for series, and it would be following a movie. So I wanted the show to feel like a movie, but at the time, my idea about the show was I wanted to do an adult, R-rated show about sex and relationships from a female point of view, and that I felt like, and I wanted to do a comedy. I felt like so many of the comedies out there were like, which I enjoyed, but they were about, so much of the humor came from euphemisms and things you couldn't say, and the comedy came from how they were wink wink saying, what you weren't allowed to say on television. And I thought, you know what? I think a lot of my career, when I look back on it, has been about trying to push the boundaries of television, and I thought, I want to do something that's like, there are no boundaries, and let's really do a show that's frank and honest about sexuality, and it's not about showing skin or showing breasts. I mean, everybody can see pornography. It's not about that, but how do you tell something that's honest, do a show that's honest and frank about sex and relationships in a relevant and humorous way. So I never thought Sex and the City was going to be a hit. I mean, it wasn't my intention. It wasn't like, I mean, it was sort of it was my antidote to Central Park West, which in fact was so, highly, trumpeted and, got such a, it was kind of almost shoved down viewers' throats by CBS. It was like, had such a gigantic campaign, and yet it was still always going to be a network show. And I just thought, I want to do something that is like the antidote to that, and something that felt like a personal project for television. And so I think when you do that, you don't expect, I never ever expected the level of success that Sex and the City has. I felt that when we finished the first season, I thought what we did was amazing, but I had no idea how it'd be received. But my reasons for doing it at the beginning were just really to do something that I thought I could watch and my friends could watch and like feel like there were no sort of excuses saying like, oh, this is like a network show, or this is that it would just be like something that could just like exist as something sort of that didn't feel like television.
Mm-hmm. So did you get a full order right away, or did you have to make a pilot, see if it would get picked up?
I made a pilot.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we made a pilot, and I was a big fan of Sarah Jessica Parker, and I thought she was like, just sort of for me the perfect actress who brought that right amount of like intelligence and humor, and I thought just like she just had the right energy and the right vibe, and could carry off this character who I thought, first of all, was the idea that a woman would be, kind of free and open about her sexuality and having a lot of sex and be that independent, and the audience would not think she was a bitch, because I think that was a real, that there was that was a fine line, especially then, that an independent woman who was very very owned her sexuality, that people would say, oh my God, she's bitchy, or she's like too strong. And Sarah, had just an incredible likability that she could do all that, and you still loved her.
Mm-hmm.
So she was the first big piece of the puzzle for me in terms of putting it together.
Did you write with her in mind?
I didn't write with her in mind, but when I wrote it and thought about who could do this, she's the person that came to me, popped into my head. And again, it's like there was no, like 90210, there was no sense at HBO like, wow, this is going to be a big hit show. Mm-hmm. It was like I had to push hard to even get the pilot made. It was like I brought Susan Seidelman in to direct it, who I wanted to bring a female director in and a feature director, and I love some of the movies she'd done, like Desperately Seeking Susan, and she had a nice New York sensibility, so she came in to direct it, and I got Sarah involved, and I thought that was great for HBO also because she was a name, and that's it. Just we did a pilot, and it went from there. They were always amazing collaborators and very supportive. But I think when you look back on these things, it always seems like, it was just, it was so, everything was preordained, but it completely wasn't,
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about casting the other three lead actresses. Mm-hmm. Kim Cattrall as Samantha Jones.
Kim, we didn't cast Kim initially as Samantha. There was another actress that was cast, and I showed the tape to my partner at the time, who's a director, who said, you can't cast that woman, you can't do it. You have to cast Kim Cattrall. And I said, well, Kim is, she passed on the role, and he was friends with her, and he called her and basically said, asked her, please have lunch with me. And I went out and we had lunch, and she, was very gun shy about doing a series, and then she agreed to go in and test for it, and HBO and Chris Albrecht were really great about recognizing that she was the better person for the role, and so we cast her, and it's one of those things where you think, you know what, I'm not sure the show would have, without Kim, it wouldn't have worked. I mean, that's why casting is so important, and you just have to get, the stars just have to align so completely that you wonder how any shows where it all works out, it's all, you just are very, there's just so much good fortune involved in getting the right cast together, and you need that right cast. You need the script and you need the cast.
Mm-hmm. Kristen Davis as Charlotte York.
Kristen, I cast on Melrose Place, so I knew Kristen, and I just felt like she had, knowing Kristen, I thought she had the qualities of a Charlotte. I could see her doing it. I could picture her doing it, and so, yeah. So that was for me, that was an easy call.
And then Cynthia Nixon.
Cynthia, I wasn't really familiar with, and she came in to read, and she was a very well-known. She had a big Broadway career, and the character was a redhead, and this is sort of maybe a example of my lack of imagination, but at the time Cynthia had blonde hair. She came in to read, and I just thought, but the character's a redhead. I just don't see her. She's a redhead. And then I'm like, oh yeah, you can color her hair. Yeah, so I mean, Cynthia was, I think she was kind of like this, just had so much Broadway cred and just actress cred coming into this, and so good in the show, in fact, that it took me a long time before I was even able to sort of realize that Cynthia Nixon was not Miranda. I mean, I just assumed Cynthia Nixon that she was Miranda. That was her personality. That's who she was, and she's nothing like Miranda. But it really did take me about like an entire season to understand how Cynthia was completely not Miranda as a person and a human being. She just inhabited that role.
And then New York City is often talked about as a character on Sex and the City.
Right.
Talk a little about that.
I think that goes back to the fact that I came out here, when I did Central Park West, that I wanted to showcase New York on television, and that I sort of had a personal love affair with the city, and that it just kind of continued. I kind of with Sex and the City, and I kind of feel like Central Park West to me was like a dress rehearsal for Sex and the City for me, in that I learned how to shoot New York, and it was just I wanted the show to be a love letter to the city, and it was about characters that love the city and love being here, and I think that's what my time living here, that I kind of understood that one thing I love about New York is that people that live here just have such a passion for being here and being New Yorkers, and I think that's really kind of a singular thing. I don't feel that people love LA, but they don't love LA the way New Yorkers love New York. And I thought that was that New York, that's the feeling that I began to have about New York after living here. And so I wanted to sort of, make that love of New York sort of part of the show.
Talk about the wardrobe and fashion on the show.
It was, I think you got to go back to looking at the column where at the top of every column there's a Manolo Blahnik sitting at the top of the column, just kind of like the signature of the column in the book. And Candace herself is Candace Bushnell, incredibly fashionable woman. She's like a hanger. She can wear anything, and clothes were a big part of her life. And the idea, Candace herself was, for me, a big inspiration for how this character would dress and behave.
For Carrie specifically?
For Carrie, yes. For Carrie. So it was that was always a big part of the character from sort of the very beginning, is that this was a woman who was devoted. She was a writer and also devoted to fashion. Would rather spend money on clothes than food, and that was Candace. Candace was for me big inspiration and sort of guiding light in some ways in terms of who this character was at the beginning.
Was Candace involved creatively with the show?
She was a consultant at the beginning. I think she was. I think for me, knowing her, it was I was able to sort of by osmosis get a lot of her her in there, and I think when you look at the fashion and you look at the behavior of Carrie, especially at the beginning, there's a lot of Candace in there.
Mm-hmm. So were you the showrunner for Sex and the City then?
Yes.
So you were on set and in the writer's room?
Yes, everywhere, yes, yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that writer's room on Sex and the City.
It was a lot of fun. The writer's room was I would say everybody was so open and raw about their stories, which is how we got our stories for Sex and the City. And I think I felt like we should all be signing non-disclosure agreements in that writer's room, because I think it was the first time I was really in a writer's room. Certainly I can think back to, personal experiences that came into play in terms of other shows that I've done, but Sex and the City was really, everybody in that writer's room, especially the women that came in later on, like Jenny and Cindy, were just really kind of tearing their hearts out and giving us stories and raw material, and we were trying to get as much. I think the idea was let's find stories that come from experience and a place of truth, as much as possible, and that we can kind of inject into the lives of these characters. And also we were, at the beginning it was very much me and Michael Patrick King. That first season, I think it was mainly just two of us, and I think we had, I remember times when we were just sort of like, laughing so hard at things we've come up with. For us, we were amusing ourselves, and I think that's what we were always doing with Sex and the City. We were, all the writers that would come through the door and be part of that writers' room, which I kind of felt like was like a little fraternity once you were in it. We were really just, telling stories that we were cracking ourselves up. Mm-hmm. And I still take, to this day, because Sex and the City was the first real pure comedy that I did, because I didn't come, as a screenwriter, I think the movies I wrote were comedies. I took a detour into drama with 90210 and Melrose Place, although I think Melrose Place can be looked at as a comedy of sorts. But I really wanted to write a comedy. So Sex and the City for me was, but I wasn't a sitcom writer. I was more of like a single camera film. And I think that's something also, that's really important to mention about Sex and the City was there weren't any single camera film shows, comedies without laugh tracks. That was a real anomaly. That just didn't exist. I think there was one show that I loved from years ago was A Days and Nights of Molly Dodd. I thought was a really good, strong, smart show. But I wanted to do a show that didn't have a laugh track and didn't write hard, and wasn't about hard jokes. And I think that's one thing that all the writers that came into the show that came from a real comedy background was, I felt like we couldn't. One thing that they brought in amazing senses of humor, but at the same time, I felt like we couldn't write it. I didn't want any hard jokes on Sex and the City. I didn't want any punchlines. If someone basically said something that was that funny, somebody else would have to laugh at it. One of the other characters, but the humor had to come from. It wasn't about hard jokes and a laugh track. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, okay, now how do we be funny in the context of more like making a little movie every week? And that was sort of my intention. That was, for me, Sex and the City was like doing a movie every week, like a little half-hour film every week.
So did you find it refreshing then that there were no commercial breaks for HBO? Was that?
It was fantastic. Mm-hmm. Writing, the thing about when I sort of thought about how I would construct the show and how would I write the show, the big difference for me writing Sex and the City was the show was written thematically. Every show dealt with a question or that Carrie was exploring that would resonate through the lives of the other characters. And that kind of storytelling creates more thoughtful storytelling. It produces more thoughtful storytelling, less plotty storytelling. You still have stories, but what's driving the story isn't, you have something driving the story that's already thoughtful. So that kind of storytelling we didn't have to write to act breaks and kind of jeopardy every 12 minutes. And so it freed up a whole different kind of storytelling. And again, I wasn't thinking of this as television. I was thinking of this as some sort of something in between television and film. And from the beginning, I thought all I want to do with this show is break all the rules. I just wanted to break every rule that ever was about television and sort of half-hour comedy storytelling. I had done that, and I'd luckily had a lot of success on network television, and now I wanted to do everything that wasn't network television.
So you actually had characters speak to the camera in
Yes.
those early seasons, and then it kind of eliminated that later on. Can you speak a little bit about why you got rid of that convention?
I felt like that at the beginning, I think one of my big influencers was Woody Allen, and I think when you think about Sex and the City, I think you can think that it went from Annie Hall to Manhattan, like Woody's work. Annie Hall, he just basically just let it loose in terms of every kind of, he had animation and characters talking to the camera and any kind of affectation in a way, not affectation, but like, it was like it was kind of like, for me, it was like the loosening of all the boundaries. And then as the show grew, I think, and people got very connected to the characters, I felt like, okay, we didn't need that anymore, and in fact, it felt like a distraction, and it felt like it took the audience out of the show. So it just sort of like made a decision to like, let's not do it after I think it was probably after the second season. I just, didn't want to do it anymore.
All right, let's take a short break.
Sure.